Greek PM Lucas Papadimos has warned of uncontrollable economic chaos if Parliament does not approve a plan for fresh cuts on Sunday. New austerity measures have already been adopted by the Greek cabinet to secure a €130 billion bailout from the EU and International Monetary Fund. And without it, the country could default in March. For more perspective on this, we're now joined live from Chicago by Margaret Bogenrief of the financial advisory firm ACM Partners. Margaret, thank you so much indeed for your time. So, despite 6 ministers stepping down, the coalition managed to clear the new cuts. So how do you think the Parliament will vote?
Well, in my opinion, I think the Parliament will ultimately pass this, and here's why. Frankly, it's politically untenable if they don't. What happens to Greece if these austerity measures are not passed is that Greece defaults. That's essentially signing the country's death warrant. Now, by signing in these austerity measures, it's important to keep in mind that the Parliament is not actually guaranteeing what's going to happen next, because these measures actually go to the powers that be, which then decide whether these austerity measures are enough for the bailout to go through. Now, what's interesting about that is both German politicians and the finance minister have come out the past few days and said, hey, Greece, this looks great, but we still don't think that this is enough. So for as much chaos that has been going on in Greece, as much as that's making the news, the thing I find most interesting is, yes, Parliament will probably pass it, but that's not a guarantee that the European Union will.
And we know that the New Deal includes firing 15,000 civil servants and lowering the minimum wage. How can this affect the already shrinking Greek economy in the long term?
Well, what I think is interesting about this is, firstly, like you said, a decrease in 15,000 public sector jobs, a 22% decrease in minimum wage. I think what you're first going to see, much like Greek economists have been saying, is a shrink in the economy of 4 to 5% this year. Think about what that means for a country already on the brink of, social, not necessarily collapse, but definitely instability and economic, not ruin, but certainly, it's certainly not growing and things certainly aren't getting better. A decrease of 4 to 5% of growth combined with austerity measures, combined with the political pressures of the European Union, will definitely disrupt Greece significantly in 2012.
And even the former Greek leader, George Papandreou, has admitted that austerity was the only way forward for Greece, despite the crisis costing him his post. And the current Prime Minister, Papadimos, has been warning of chaos in case Greece is forced to default. So what options does Greece really have?
Here's what I think is interesting. I get asked this question a lot. What's the third option? What's the magic policy bullet? There is none. Greece is either going to commit to austerity measures, which I and many economists argue still is not enough to guarantee that Greece won't default, or it will default just sooner rather than later. A lot of people are talking about disorderly default. I don't think the European Union nor Greece is going to allow that to occur. But frankly, I think the markets have been fooling themselves the last 6 months by thinking that there's a better or third option. And I think finally what's really interesting is we keep talking about this March deadline. Greece is going to default by March. I don't know, or, they won't should they commit to these austerity measures. I don't think March is necessarily a hard and fast deadline, but I do think that indicates a systematic problem in the markets watching this. Something's going to come along, something's going to get better. It's just not. This could drag down for months and years if there's not a, stop put to it, which I think you're seeing Merkel trying to do right now.
Yeah, and if Greece defaults and the Eurozone plunges into chaos, what could it mean for the rest of the world? So what would the global impact be?
I think that's a great question. So firstly, let's take a look at Eastern Europe, because I think a lot of people are ignoring this fact. 22% of Romanian banking is done through Greece. Think about that. Nearly a quarter of the banking of a major Eastern European country is done through Greece. So it defaults. That's going to plunge much of Eastern Europe into, frankly, at least a recession, if not a depression. Let's look at Russia. A Greek default, a shrinking European economy, that means lower consumption of gasoline and oil. Now, looking at Russia, things certainly are not stable as they stand. You see a decrease in consumption of energy, you see a decrease in prices, you see a decrease in living standard there, I think that instability continues to deepen. Let's take a look at the United States. Obviously, our import numbers are going to decrease significantly, putting a halt to any kind of growth we've been kidding ourselves that we have this year. We have an election coming up in 2012 in November. What does that mean for us? That will certainly affect here. And finally, let's look at China. Europe is China's largest trading partner. Right now, China is predicting more than 8% growth this year. Greece defaults, the European economies finally, and arguably they should have been for a while, contract. China's growth slows below 8%. They have a massive demographic problem as it stands. You look at that, you'll see a gross instability there as well. And I think what's really interesting about that is everyone's been turning to China as kind of a bright spot in all of this. I think that's going to prove to be false in the next 12 months.
And also, just to remind our viewers, Eurozone countries were downgraded by 2 American ratings agencies in January. Do you think there is anything to the theory that U.S. interests are being served by these agencies, by them causing further damage to European economic prospects to benefit American business?
Okay, so I have spoken pretty openly that I'm not a large proponent of the ratings agencies. They're private groups. I think there's a lot that they do that's not necessarily, I don't want to say above the board, but certainly not, economically pure. Here's the thing. Whether they did it to serve American interests or not, they just observed what's actually happening. Think about this. In March, Greece owes 14.1 billion euros. They can't pay their bills without this bailout. By any economic stretch of reason, that is not a healthy country. And more importantly, that's a country that deserves to be put on even more severe watch. So while I know I've heard a lot about, serving American business and economic interests, well, I don't necessarily agree with the platform it's coming from. I do agree with the general consensus.
All right, Margaret Bogenrief of the financial advisory firm ACM Partners. Margaret, thank you so much indeed. It's appreciated.